Hello and welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. My name is Bernie Schlager and I serve as Executive Director of CLGS. I use he, him pronouns. Welcome to CLGS. Today you are here for a CLGS Latinx Roundtable Event, Queer Latinx Spirituality, Identity, Liminality, and Activism with Professor Ish Ruíz. This roundtable event from the Latinx Roundtable explores the vibrant intersections of faith, identity, and activism by delving into the unique experiences of queer Latinx individuals, navigating spirituality within cultural and societal contexts. By examining themes of liminality, resilience, and social justice, the discussion highlights how spirituality becomes a space for both personal empowerment and collective action. We're glad that you're here to discuss this topic with Professor Ruíz, who is Assistant Professor of Latinx and Queer Decolonial Theology here at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. He holds a PhD in Theology and Ethics from the Graduate Theological Union. A native of Puerto Rico and a queer Latinx theologian, Dr. Ruíz's research interests explore the intersections between queer theology, Latinx theology, ecclesiology, sexual ethics, liberation, human rights, and Catholic education. He is the author of LGBTQ+ Educators in Catholic Schools, Synodality, Inclusivity, and Justice, and is the editor of Cornerstones, Sacred Stories of LGBTQ+ Employees in Catholic Institutions. He is also the author of numerous academic articles. We welcome each of you, and we welcome you, Dr. Ruíz.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Schlager, for the introduction, and welcome to the Latinx Roundtable. As Dr. Schlager mentioned, I am one of the coordinators of the roundtables at CLGS, specifically the coordinator for the Latinx Roundtable, and it is my honor to be here with you today. The plan for today involves a little bit of discussion, just because I don't want to be the one taking up all this time talking, but I thought that what I would do is introduce and bring us into a conversation about spirituality and ask some questions about what a queer Latinx perspective could possibly contribute to the spiritual life. I very much think of this not so much as some sort of research on queer Latinx spirituality empirically and universally or categorically, but rather a proposal, very much grounded in personal experience in many ways, but also grounded in just some of the scholarship that has preceded this work, and so hopefully we will generate some good conversations. I do have some slides to guide us, but just be advised that at one point I will request that you unmute yourself and enter into conversation. So with that, let's go ahead and take it on. Let me share my screen. And by the way, I will be introducing, or how do you call it? I will be doing a bit more of a self-introduction as we go through these slides. I just want to make sure that when we go through this, that I emphasize that this is very much a very personal journey of uncovering what a queer Latinx spirituality could look like, as well as a communal process whereby I've learned from many members of my own community, but also of the scholarship, the scholarly tradition that is at this intersection of queer Latinx Christianity. So with that, let me begin. All right, can we see these slides? Yes, good. All right. So I framed this conversation of queer Latinx spirituality in terms of liminality. The word liminality comes from the word limens, which is about a threshold. So it's about crossing some sort of threshold. And so liminality, we tend to refer to it as an in-between. Liminality research really applies across many fields. So obviously in the field that we're in, theology and spirituality, liminality plays a role. When we think about our Christian tradition, liminality is in many instances throughout the major, woven throughout the major parts of our Christian tradition. I can think about a scripture passage that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? I can think of, in the beginning there was nothing, and then God said, or in the beginning there was God. So we have these threshold moments where God crosses and makes something happen. And so the liminal space is often referred to as this like in-between space, in between. So we can think of liminality chronologically as that this was what was before, then we crossed this threshold, and what happened in that threshold, and now we have the after, right? So we can think of it chronologically. When we think of liminality chronologically, we think of the concept of transformation. So we were in one way before, and then in another way after. Right? Then there's a different kind of liminality, the liminality of coexistence, where we exist in two realities at once. And here's the liminality that we hear in Latinx theology, for example, when we discuss the concept of mestizaje theology. And so what I do in here is that when I talk about liminality, I am really synthesizing both dynamics, the dynamic that is chronological, the before and then after. So liminality as a space of transformation, of metanoia, but also a liminality of occupying, of multiplicity, of plurality within oneself. And so liminality can take those two lenses. I talk about, for example, political liminality in that sense, whereby as Puerto Rican, for example, I am a part of the U.S., but also a second-class citizen and member of a U.S. colony. So that's a political type of liminality where there's that mestizaje in which I occupy multiple identities that, are not always necessarily as easily coalescing. However, I also think of political liminality chronologically, whereby we are in one political reality, and we're also in the process of transforming our reality. And so we are currently in a liminal space between what was and what will be. Okay. Same thing with our bodies. And here I take a lot of lessons from transgender persons who, go through a sense of liminality whereby they have one identity and then they grow through, they go through this liminal space, they cross this threshold and then enter into another identity, or more like live more fully into that identity. However, at the same time, their body, they still retain this identity as trans, right? And so there is a duality here, already a transgression of this binary of male and female that transgender people occupy always. So even though there's a chronological liminality and threshold, there's also a mestizaje liminality, and that there's a transgression or a participation in two identities that are not necessarily harmoniously coexisting, right? Not necessarily. Then, of course, we have questions of spiritual liminality. And here I can think of, the famous phrase of being in this world, but not of this world. This idea that as spiritual beings, we both have a body, but also a soul, but also there's that mestizaje sense, right? Of like, how do we integrate our spiritual components of ourselves with our embodied components of ourselves? But also the chronological one. Like, think about the many ways in which you have crossed thresholds and been in in-between spaces spiritually, right? The liminal experience often involves several components, and pain is one of them. Very few people in my life, perhaps my partner being one of them, are often excited about change. So we don't tend to enjoy the process of change as much. Some people do, but by and large, many of us do not really love the idea that, oh, I'm going to go through a process of transformation. That often involves pain. It involves pain in many ways. Sometimes there is a current pain that provokes that liminal process of transformation, but sometimes it is something else that provokes the transformation, some sort of necessity, some sort of need, some sort of desire. Think about times in which you've pursued a dream and stepped out of your comfort zone. And so it is the liminal experience itself that is painful. Sometimes painful is the pain that we experience in the liminal experience, in the liminal process, in this process of transformation, of entering this in-between space, is something that we enter willingly. and sometimes it's an unwilling experience just imposed on us, right? Liminality involves a degree of isolation. Even though we go through these processes sometimes as a community, and sure, yeah, ultimately, the process of liminality in many ways involves an individual autonomous choice, and that can feel a little isolating. Okay, and so part of the idea of liminality is, how do we enter this threshold, this in-between space, and how do we balance the components of that process that are individual personal processes as well as communal, communal ones. The liminal experience is not only a painful one, it is often it can often be a place of refuge, a place where we enter in order to survive, right? And of course, it involves a transformation. For some people push back against this idea of transformation and say no. Some people live in a liminal space their entire lives. Like, think about a person of color in a majority white community who lives there the majority of their life or their whole life. That person might be in a perpetual state of liminality. It's not like liminality becomes a threshold from before to after. And so that's why I mesh this chronological liminality with this mestizaje liminality, whereby we enter or we live in both of those places. Okay. So that's where when we talk about liminality, these are perhaps some of the things that I mention or that I dwell on when I think of this concept. Okay, here I want to introduce myself as a person who straddles all of these identities. And I always say, I am a Puerto Rican Catholic, I'm a Puerto Rican queer, and I'm a Catholic queer. Oops. And I am a Catholic queer. And what's interesting about these three identities is that they do not necessarily coalesce harmoniously, right? And one must think, well, Puerto Rican and Catholic, those two things tend to be together. Yes and no. I think I wasn't really aware of perhaps some of the conflicts that the Catholic tradition, even the broader Christian tradition, engage in when they interact with Puerto Rican culture and history. If I think about my island right now, the vast majority of the island is Catholic. The vast majority of Puerto Ricans belong to this church. And so you would think that Catholicism is more of the norm in Puerto Rico. And yeah, sure, in many ways that's true. However, what is also true if you study Puerto Rican history is that Catholicism was often used as a way to colonize. And so when we think about Puerto Rican identity and Christian identity, there is a historical tension there, whereby Puerto Ricans are not just Puerto Rican. We also have within us an indigenous component, an African component, and a white European component. And so even when you think about Puerto Rican identity within itself, it often is a little bit ironic that many Puerto Ricans identify so freely as Catholic Puerto Ricans, but have some sort of amnesia of the fact that Catholicism was often a tool of colony for indigenous and Black enslaved persons. So between my Puerto Rican, and the thing is that I practiced my Puerto Rican Catholicism throughout the majority of my childhood with my head down, not really thinking. It was mostly a ritualistic devotionalist, yes, God, yes, Father, yes, sister. And so it wasn't until my adult life when I started realizing the many ways in which Catholicism subjugates Puerto Rican culture and turns Puerto Rican culture into a passive culture that doesn't necessarily fight for justice. And so many Puerto Ricans have drank a Kool-Aid of Catholicism as a pious devotionalist tradition. And so I had to do some figuring out here because I couldn't really, I couldn't really synthesize a Puerto Rican identity that is so interested in decolonizing, especially as a part of the US, with a Catholic identity that is so much about devotionalism and following rules, right? Puerto Rican and queer identity is interesting. So there's a scholar called Lawrence LaFontaine Stokes, and he talks a lot about how queer Puerto Ricans, he has a book called Queer Ricans, queer Puerto Ricans often have to choose between culture, our own culture and our sexual identity. So between our queer and our Puerto Rican identity. And that's often a very intense mixture, right? And so I'm going to give you some examples. Most people don't know this, but prior to 2015's legalization of same-sex marriage, Puerto Rico actually had an island-wide referendum where they shut down same-sex marriage. So Puerto Ricans actually voted against same-sex marriage a few months before it became the law of the land with the Obergefell decision. Okay. As a result, a lot of Puerto Ricans on the island who are homophobic and cisnormative, they consider LGBTQ plus activism to be an American pursuit. So it was because it was the US that imposed same-sex marriage on the island via the Supreme Court, while Puerto Ricans had already voted against it. And so a lot of times, the queer community in Puerto Rico is seen as an anti-Puerto Rican, colonized, ideologically colonized ideology that rejects the traditional Puerto Rican culture of a man and a woman as the nucleus of the Puerto Rican family. And so queerness is now associated with this ultra radical progressive US and not so much with the local Puerto Rican. And in fact, I can remember when I was during my own coming out process, my name is Ismael Ruiz, and I am actually Ismael III. I'm named after my dad, who's named also after his dad. So one of the things during my coming out process, which was a very tumultuous process, my parents and I now are best friends. But when I first came out, it was tough on them, and they did not take it well. And that, resulted in not a very good coming out process. One of the things my parents told me was that I should change my name and my last name because my grandparents would be ashamed. And so it's this idea that queerness does not just become an affront to some sexual expectation, but it's also an affront to Puerto Rican culture itself. Okay. And finally, obviously, I don't have to dwell too much on Catholic and queer with its gender essentialism and the complementarity of man and woman that many of the Catholic tradition, but also the broader Christian tradition adopts. And so this process, what this created was, I'm going to put my cursor here in between Puerto Rican and Catholic, in between Puerto Rican and queer, in between Catholic and queer. So that's where I lived. I occupied this mestizaje type of mixture between Puerto Rican and Catholic, Puerto Rican and queer, Catholic and queer, and those identities did not really get along. And so I experienced that mestizo type of liminality. Okay, chronologically, I went from a place of disintegration to a place of integration, where how do I move from Puerto Rican and Catholic, Puerto Rican versus Catholic, to being a Puerto Rican Catholic? And the truth is that prior to that process of chronological transformation, that metanoia process, prior to it, it was painful and it was disintegrated. And I felt like I had to put away part of my identity to be the other. Okay. And I had to reject some of the stuff that I was learning in my Puerto Rican history class about Puerto Rico being a decolonizing culture every time I went to church and bowed my head. But I also had to put out some of that, put down some of that devotionalist Catholic culture every time I engaged in a Puerto Rican political act of resistance, right? Same thing with Puerto Rican and queer. Okay. I can participate in Puerto Rican culture as long as I was straight acting, or I can be queer and know that Puerto Rican culture is not the safest place. So I got to reject that for a little bit. And same with Catholic and queer. And so there was this like push and pull. Okay. So what I'm trying to propose here is a four-part spirituality, a four-part process, really divided into two main parts. And I use the two parts. I grab these two parts from Jose Esteban Muñoz's work, and I grab the concept of disidentification and utopia. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So the four parts are divided into two sections. Section one is disidentification, which has part one and part two. And then the second section is utopia, which has parts 3 and part 4. And again, this is a proposal for what a queer spirituality could look like. Here is something that I'm interested in asking you. In our discussion later, I'll be interested in asking what you think of it. The reason for this is that I'm working on this as a book. So part of this workshop is a selfish, part of this conversation is a selfish workshop for my own book idea. So I'll be interested in hearing what some of your thoughts are on this proposal on a queer Puerto Rican spirituality. All right, so section 1 is disidentification, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, the disidentification part. But here, what I'm proposing is that people enter into a process of deconstruction and reconstruction, okay? we have to dismantle each component of our identities, our Puerto Ricanness, our queerness, and our faith, in order to reconstruct it in light of the other. Okay, why? Because we grow up and we are taught these identities. These identities are, I believe, constructed and largely taught, but we are taught these identities throughout our childhood. And so it's a process of deconstructing what we have learned. Okay, this part two is this idea of integration and euphoria. I say the reconstruction is a part of it, but it leads into this sense of integration and euphoria. Jose Esteban Munoz calls this a sense of a brown commons. And here is where some of that integration allows us to engage in communal acts of solidarity. So the integration is not just internal, but also among other people. And there's an experience of euphoria. And here, I engage in language of flourishing, right? Euphoria perhaps has a little bit of a hedonistic connotation. I don't intend it. I'm talking about euphoria in the sense of, like, in Spanish, plenitud, like feeling like we are happy, but not as an emotion, rather as a state of feeling fulfilled, okay? An idea of fulfillment. The sense of self-actualization. That's the kind of euphoria I'm talking about, not just some sort of pleasurable, fuzzy feeling, okay? The second component is the component of utopia. That's section 2. And here I'm going to propose, oh, for some reason my cursor is not working. Give me a second. Let me stop my share and reshare. Huh. There we go. Here I propose a futuric vision. And again, this is like a Jose Esteban Munoz idea. Once we have this sense of utopia, when we reflect back, or that process of transformation, one of the things it yields is an idea of a world where we wouldn't have had to go through that process. Okay, and the other thing in what that vision yields is it's an impetus toward hope-filled action. Okay. Here, let's take each one of these one by one, right? So first, let's talk about deconstruction and reconstruction. There are some scholars here that can help us. The first is Jose Esteban Munoz, who, in his book Disidentifications, paints this idea of speaks about the process of disidentification. Disidentification refers to an act of survival. For Jose Esteban Munoz, brown queer persons realize that we are in society, but not really a part of society. Think of it as this way. Society was not built for us, and we realize it really quickly. Okay? Society was not really built for us. So what we do is we engage in these disidentificatory actions, whereby we are both a part of society, but we constantly find ways to protect ourselves from it. What's an example of it? Well, going to like a gay bar would be an example of it. A gay bar very much exists in society, exists as a part of society, but it's also its own little safe haven for queer persons, right? So that's an example of disidentification. Disidentification happens when queer and brown people almost find ways to disassociate in a way from society. When queer and brown persons find a way to be in society, but also shield themselves from society. Okay, that is the idea of the disidentifications. And Gloria Anzaldúa speaks of the open wound. Gloria Anzaldúa speaks about straddling this mestiza identity, this being Chicana, so therefore a part of the US, but also a part of Mexico, but also she's a lesbian and queer. So that means that she experiences this tension as an open wound, okay? And for her, that in that open wound, she goes inward. There's an inward process, and that's what disidentification is. Sometimes disidentification manifests externally, like when I go to the gay bar, but sometimes it happens internally. Like when I decide to watch RuPaul's Drag Race on a Friday night by myself and be like, this is my sport. I'm going to not watch the Super Bowl. I'm going to watch RuPaul. When I decide I'm not going to go to church this Sunday, I know sacrilege. Instead, I'm going to go to a drag brunch and listen to this drag queen. To me, that's my church today. In fact, my partner and his friends, they put on these drag brunches, and sometimes they open like that. They happen on Sundays, and they're like, "Oh, hello everybody. Welcome to Drag Brunch Spectacular. It's a Sunday. Y'all skipped church to be here. Y'all are sinners." And I start laughing because I'm like, here we are engaging in the disidentificatory action where we're kind of doing something that seems very social, like going to a brunch, but it's also very queer and isolated. And during this time, it's almost like we temporally exist in a liminal space, right? And so that's the idea of disidentification. What happens with the deconstruction and reconstruction? Well, we enter these disidentified spaces. And we experience pain and we experience crises. The reason we have a drag brunch is because the drag queens are not invited to regular brunch. The reason we go to the gay bar is because the gays are not welcome in the regular bar, okay? The reason we have RuPaul's Drag Race is because people are not allowed those gender expressions in regular society, okay? So we have this pain, this crisis, so we have to enter this liminal space, this disidentified space. But that is the space where transformation happens. That's the space where I can feel, like I can start synthesizing the components of my identity. And it's a pedagogical approach. Here I told you that liminality applies to different fields. So what I started doing when I started researching liminality is I started researching liminality theory in other fields. And as an educator, I was very drawn to pedagogy. And I found this article by a bunch of scholars that said that the classroom is also a liminal space. It is a threshold space that a student enters, and it is a place where they are both entering with their knowledge, but also about to acquire knowledge that they didn't possess previously. So there is a mestizaje in the act of learning between what I know and what I will learn. It's not like we flip that switch. We constantly grab what we know and we synthesize it with what we don't yet know. And that's called learning, okay? So learning is always a liminal process, involves a threshold. And when I say threshold, you're standing at the threshold in between those two moments, between what you don't know and what you do know. That's learning. But also it's a chronological liminality, whereby learning transforms you between the person you were before you knew all this and the person you are after you learn it. There's a reason we put the terms doctor after someone finishes a doctorate. Okay, we give each other these designations. You graduate high school, you get a diploma, okay? Because learning is very much that chronological transformation. And that's what we call metanoia, right? That gradual transformation. So what happens with what happens with deconstruction and reconstruction is, going back to the concept of identity, is what happens if spiritually I were, and now can you, I don't know if you can't raise your hand, but can you do a reaction if you have seen the Inside Out movies? The ones with the little emotions, the cartoon ones. I recommend it if you haven't seen it. They're animated movies about our different emotions: joy, sadness, fear, anger. And it's about how within our psyche, the emotions interact with each other. So I think it's going to make me sound a little bit schizophrenic or like I have multiple personality disorder. But what if I were to treat my Puerto Rican identity as one component of me, and my Catholic one and my queer one as one component? And what if I were to place them in a classroom and make them learn from each other? Okay? And so think of that spiritual process as the process of bringing your identities into this classroom where they have to interact with and learn from each other. And in a sense, my Puerto Ricanness has now entered this threshold moment where it's gonna not stay the same. And part of that requires some purging, some unlearning, right? How many of us thought, I mean, I don't know how many of you think this, but I thought that Adam and Eve were two people that literally existed when I was a kid. And then I had to learn that this is a myth, that this is simply a metaphor, an allegorical story for the creation of the world. I don't know if I'm committed some sort of act of heresy in your mind, but I don't actually believe that Adam and Eve were two persons that existed. I think that it is a mythological story that explains how Christians conceive the world being created in stages through evolution, the 7 days, etc. I had to unlearn that and relearn it. And so what parts of my Puerto Rican identity did I have to unlearn? Probably the parts that gave into colony, probably the parts that gave into machismo, like this gender, this gender type of of oppression that seeps away that moves beyond political colonization and moves into gender colonization. That's a part of Puerto Rican culture, is machista. Eh? I had to unlearn some of those things. I had to, but I had to preserve some things. I had to preserve music and dance. I had to unlearn that dance means that a man dances with a woman in salsa. I had to unlearn that only men can produce music. I had to unlearn that only the woman can be nurturer and create a familia. Okay, I had to relearn new things. But see, that learning happened when my Puerto Rican self encountered the queer self. Okay, and the Puerto Rican and queer self encountered the Catholic self and learned that there's a transcendental reality to this whole process, that we're building a kingdom that is to come, that there is a sacrificial nature to God and to Jesus, and that we're kind of like that because we were made in God's image and Jesus' image. And so this process is akin to Jesus' own process. So, and this is where I call a pedagogical approach. When we go into stage 2, the integration and euphoria, I go into Justin Sabiatanes, who talks about gender as a calling, right? And I think of Saint Irenaeus, who thinks that the glory of God is human being fully alive. There's this calling to be a self. I'm not going to say ourselves as if that existed before. Well, we are called to be somebody. I'm this bringing me back to Sister Act 2. If you want to be somebody and you want to go somewhere, you better wake up and pay attention, right? I'm thinking about this, like we are in the process of becoming constantly, okay? And that process is about becoming more fully alive, more fully ourselves, okay? And Justin Sabiatanes has this book called Transgendered, and we usually don't say, oh, that person's transgendered, as if something made them trans. But I like how he reclaims that word and says, actually, trans is about becoming. We are becoming more fully a self that is going to bring us that glory and that aliveness, that flourishing. And so we can sometimes we look at transgender talk in a very essentialist, like I was born this way, I was born trans. And I'm not going to deny or say anything like that, but I think there is also a power in looking at a trans identity as precisely this process of becoming, and there's agency in it. There's agency in it, okay? And I think that's important. Let's look at futuric vision, and here I talk about Jose Esteban Muñoz's book, Cruising Utopia. For Muñoz, the act of oppression and disidentification makes us automatically imagine this world where it doesn't happen. So when you look at a drag queen, performing, they're entertaining, they're the center of attention, and they are acting out a gender nonconforming type of, process. So I think, how interesting that a drag queen in a drag show that you might think might be sexual or just funny or maybe fierce and dancy, can you start looking at a drag show, at other forms of queer art as well, as containing some sort of subversive vision for society, for the world? Okay? And so in that sense, the act of disidentifying leads to a crafting of utopia. Jose Esteban Muñoz famously says, queerness is not here yet. It's not yet here. When we think about queerness as a transgression, we think about queerness as a transgression chronologically. So we are ushering in, through our transgression, a new vision. And we're not always, the thing with queers is that we're not always aware of what that vision is, but we sort of contain it. And so that pedagogical process, whereby I think of my queer little student learned from Catholic student and learned from Puerto Rican student how to craft a vision, a queer vision. Puerto Ricans have been crafting this vision forever because Puerto Rican oppression is very material. It's very economic. So it's easy. It's easier to imagine what the future can look like. when it's tangible. And Catholics have talked about the kingdom of God forever. But the queers have not. The queers have not envisioned anything. So my queer self had to meet my Catholic self, and had to meet my Puerto Rican self to learn what a queer flourishing looks like, or at least how to imagine one. Okay? And so that's where that pedagogical process is. And Saldúa doesn't put it in those words, but speaks of a new mestiza consciousness, where when we are mestizos, when we are in this mixture, this in-betweenness, we actually participate in this cosmic consciousness. I think of it as a border, right? If you have a country with two borders, then you're standing on the border. You're kind of standing on both countries, yes, but the border continues to trace with other countries, right? Next time you go to a map, I want you to put your finger on a border, any border, and you're going to realize that that border continues to trace other borders in between countries that you weren't before. Because if you think of borders, borders really are non-continuous lines, with perhaps some exceptions, like Vatican City would be an exception of a border that's contained within a country. But by and large, when you think of a border in Europe, that border is touching, that line is continuous. So think of mestizaje as standing on that line that is continuous, that gives you access to the fullness of identity. And so my mestizaje helps me understand a Black trans woman, even though I am none of those three things. Okay? In a particular way. Why? Because it's not about the countries that it touches. It's not about Blackness, womanness, or transness. It's not about that necessarily, but rather about the liminal experience of not belonging to each of those. And it gives me access to that. Now, what's interesting is that by and large, every human being has that experience of liminality. Even a straight white man who you might think is at the top of the totem pole, the most privileged of the privileged persons, for example, still might be in history in some moments where he might experience that liminality, especially if you start folding in age and ability. When we talk about disability, I like to always point out that every single human being has been at some point, quote unquote, disabled, at least when we were born, and might eventually experience a form of disability as we age. We think of disabled people as a separate class, not as something that every human being will experience. And so every human being, even the super rich white man, cisgender straight man, might experience an experience of liminality, of otherness at some point in their life when it intersects with their identities. And perhaps it is that experience of suffering that gives that insight. Okay, I finished with hope-filled action, and I like the idea of St. Augustine, that hope has two beautiful daughters named anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to ensure that they do not remain as they are. This process of entering the liminal space and exiting it is huge, incredibly emotional in the courageous way, but courage is in the anger way, but also it leads to courage, which is a virtue that we practice, often in small ways, but leads to bigger ways of living out courageously. Here are some questions that I have for reflection. I'm going to put them also in the chat. When it comes to deconstruction and reconstruction, I wonder, if any of you have an example of a way in which you've had to reconstruct and deconstruct a component of your faith or your spirituality or your identity. Okay, that's a question I have. With regard to integration and euphoria, I wonder if you have an experience where you felt seen for who you are fully. And what was that like? Okay. For futuric vision, I wonder if you have, my slides did not finish there. Let me finish that. Wait a second. An example, here we go. Oh no, they're in black. Let me see if I can repaint it. Let me paste this on the chat actually. Here we go. There we go. All right, let me erase some of these. Some of the formatting is off, so I'm erasing some of the bullet points really quick. Boom. All right. For futuric vision, I wonder if you can connect an example of planning and activism. So how did you find direction? Have you ever been at the center of a social movement? And how do you do that? Did you have to come in touch with your own self and your own experience, right? Don't we draw from these to draw a future? And finally, hopeful to action is a time when you changed something and what informed it. Um, what what values, what kind of virtues, what did you have to practice? What kind of skills did you have to acquire to do that? Anyhow, I'll pause here and open up for discussion for the next 20 minutes. You can either participate by sharing some of these questions that I offered for reflection, or you may just kind of give an overall analysis of the project, of the idea of integration and futurism, the idea of the disidentification plus the cruising utopia. Jose Esteban Munoz uses the word cruising utopia. Like you're almost like flirting with it and trying to like, pun intended, nail it, right? Almost like trying to like hook up with this future, become entangled with it. So if you have the ability to, I want to open up for conversation. I can also take some questions if you have any. So this is just an open discussion. I threw a lot at you. And also, if you have the ability, I encourage you to maybe show your face if you have the ability, but otherwise, no pressure. Open conversation. Go.
Professor Ruiz, I thank you for your presentation. A question I have is, so often it seems to me from my own lived experience, especially as a gay man, as a queer person, person of faith, the world around us, and that includes church, society, et cetera, is so interested in disintegrating human beings, right? And separating us out by all the different ways we are different from each other, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me the challenge, as you're talking about, the challenge is of integration. It's not ignoring those important parts of ourselves, even those that we may not want to acknowledge at times at different points in our lives. But as I've come to understand it, I think, part of my own faith journey as a queer man, as, the generation I grew up in, large family, all that kind of stuff, is trying to integrate what I've disintegrated, most often because I felt I had to separate out parts from myself. I gave part from my academic self, from all that, and that, to use maybe Warren terminology, but empire is interested in disintegration. And I look at what's happened, at the mess that's happening. Mess is not the right word; it's too tiny. Today in Washington and in our national civic life, the interest of those in power is to disintegrate individuals and to disintegrate communities. So that's just kind of my stream of conscious there. But that's what it prompted me to reflect on: is the power that disintegration can bring to those who are in charge, and the challenge of integrating ourselves.
Thank you.
Dr. Ish, always good to see you. How you doing?
Great to see you, Dundee. Always. I'm doing well. Yourself?
I had a question. Sorry, I was late. I had a question actually towards the end of your presentation. You said something that sort of shook me. You talk about exiting liminal spaces. Do we exit them?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, I can't.
Go ahead. I'm open. I'll throw that to the group.
Am I on?
Yes, you are on. We can hear you, Kathleen. Go ahead.
Okay, that's all, but I can't get on my video.
It's not a problem, Kathleen. We can hear you fine. And we know what you look like.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think, well, I've studied this myself in terms of African ritual. There's Victor Turner, I don't know if you know his work, did a lot with liminal spaces and structure and anti-structure, he calls it. So one of the things as you're becoming as you're making your process conscious, I think one thing that you're not stressing is the amount of unconscious that has to play along in this. So you do come out of these liminal spaces, but you don't know that you necessarily will. I think that's part of the pain, and the like you're looking for a new structure, you're looking for a new way to be in society, but you don't really know that you're going to get there. I mean, that's been my experience. That also happens in mourning. And part of my experience is I was with a woman for 34 years and she died in 2018. And it's like, oh, I knew that it was going to be difficult. You know, I knew it was, but wow, it went on. And also then my whole identity, which I never really identified. I was a person who tried to hop out of identity molds. I've had much harder trouble being, let's say, lesbian or gay or queer or whatever I want to call myself now, because I don't have a partner. And not having a partner really, and looking for a partner, but not like saying, I can't put a bow on my head and say, you know, I'm looking for a partner. And I haven't done the video game because I don't want to do that. But the point is there's a whole lot of unconscious stuff is happening, and you have to be kind of patient in the sign of patience is suffering kind of way. You know, so that's what I found with this liminal process, and that's enough probably for now. But I find it fascinating what you're doing, and I like your categories very much. I just think you need to just include a little bit more of the uncertainty, which is so difficult. How is this going to come out? Like, what's going to happen? Am I going to be alive for it? Am I going to make it through? You know, just a lot of stress involved.
That's great.
I appreciate
I'm taking this and I'm adding it to my notes.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Kathleen. And I think that was the uncertainty point is what I was thinking of, and what I really kind of like and enjoy and sort of expect in life. And it's kind of like, you know, you said you don't know if you're going to get there.
Yeah.
And I sort of wonder sometimes if I even know when I'm there, you know? If I do get there, do I know it? And my tendency is to assume that I'm not there, so that I'm always transitioning or going somewhere, you know?
Right.
That's interesting.
Here's what's interesting to me is that it leads me to think that the experience of in-betweenness and disintegration is so painful, yet is often coupled with these moments of euphoric joy that perhaps hint at the idea that we have crossed some threshold. And so perhaps it's more, instead of like a linear process, perhaps it's a little bit more of a spiral, right? But we experience moments, instances chronologically of this integration, yes. Of integration. We experience those moments, and we know because we can, you know, we can clock the joy and the euphoria and the grace we feel. And so I don't want to dismiss that. And oftentimes when we talk about these intersections, we talk about it in terms of oppression, which is true. And politically speaking, the oppression hasn't changed, but internally and spiritually, there is something to be said about the euphoria that a queer Puerto Rican might feel. An example would be with that Bomba Day that we did at, you know, like an instance of that, you know. And so I must wonder if there is something like that. Manny.
Sorry, I'm on my PC and my video is also acting up. It's going on and up. Thank you for naming the euphoric state. I'm also particularly interested in that as well. And your framing of trans world, the drag world, as a sense of growing edge, because I think there's a reason why this administration, this fascist administration, is attacking trans or trans community is
Christian
because
trans.
it's because we are learning a lot from the what you're naming a metanoia, right? And accepting a growing of self and exploration of self. And you also frame the interacting with our multiple selves. I thought that's a really interesting way of exploration. So going back to this euphoria, I was thinking of like in what way you either experienced or maybe your increase these moments for our communities, those that are still struggling with their sexuality. You name bomb. So I imagine, so like I've shared in our community, I'm fascinated by dance, but also it's not always happen where we hit that euphoric moment. Sometimes we only stay of entertainment, right? It's kind of like going to church. Not every you have this euphoric, this sense of fulfillment. Certain things have to be in particular sequences has to happen. A being has to be present in order to access this place of fulfillment. So I'm curious, like how, what are some things, what are those components that you would set in place to increase that?
Yeah, it's hard to speak. I'm taking notes on what you're saying, so I'm typing just because I want to, like I said, I'm working on this. This is a book that I'm putting together, so that I'm writing. So I want to make sure that I, frame things as I should. It's kind of hard to speak universally about things that need to be together, that must be there, right? Especially because I don't think that this integration can always be facilitated. I think the integration often happens, internally, even in places where there isn't a safe space. I think places like safe spaces, like a gay club or a dance class or a drag show, can help facilitate some of that process. But at the same time, I can imagine that even before there were these clubs, some people were already doing this imagining. Okay, and I can imagine that, like, queer identities right now are very popular, and so the gay clubs exist a lot in a lot of places, but switch out queer for something else. What happens with disability? Disability and identity. What happens with some of these that are perhaps not as popular right now, as socially acceptable, or so these are the questions that I often have. It would be hard for me to think of this as something that can be facilitated. But my goal with this project is perhaps something that is to create some sort of insight or inner awareness of perhaps that inner life that's happening, that spirituality that is happening. And so I could imagine that a book like this, for example, could turn into a little bit of like a constructive proposal for how we can think of our own spirituality in the midst of this identity. But I don't know that we can create, that we can facilitate it. That said, some things that have aided my journey, which I think might aid other people's journeys, are precisely the presence of those safe spaces where the identity can be explored. The presence of role models or some sort of guidance, someone who's done something like this before. And that can take place in the form of spiritual direction, but also, like, we do have like media, and we can blast ideas right, left, and center, right? So perhaps that's the way it happens. I guess it is a form of safe space, but it's sort of safe, but like, I guess the ability to take risks. I think there's a safety in being able to take risks. So being able to explore something, being able to, and like a risk I took was like the first time I shared a kiss with a boy, and I was in high school. I was like, that was really risky. So that's perhaps something that was there. Yeah, that helped me try something on, you know?
I think the concept itself that you're actually exposing the concept of liminality, which isn't exactly new, but it's something that people aren't that familiar with. When I was in the mourning process, it was interesting because a friend of mine wrote me a letter about a minister's sermon which emphasized liminality, and I thought, oh my God, of course, I'm in a liminal state, because I had studied this in my own research like 15, 20 years before, okay? And once I found out I was in a liminal state, I had tremendous hope because I knew that it would be processed through, and it did. It was processed through. I mean, that phase of it was. Yes. And so this, I mean, just laying this out as liminality and giving people kind of a sensitivity of the richness, I would call it a richness of the theory or the conceptualization, I think would be very beneficial.
Thank you, Kathleen. That means a lot. I hadn't thought about grief, but that's, I mean, because there are all these theories of grief, right? That you go through like the process, the stages of grief.
Yeah, but it's, yeah.
But it's not as linear, right? But also
not linear. Right?
Yeah, right. And there's these other theories of grief where like the sphere one, where you kind of carry the grief, like your partner doesn't come back to life. Like the grief is still there.
All those
But
things.
the way you address it, and so there is a threshold here that you've crossed.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, you know, I can think of a breakup and, you know, me crying myself to sleep. And then at one point I kind of stopped crying about it, you know?
Yeah.
So then that grief that takes place. Yeah. But
well, in the African context, that's why I want you to explore the Victor Turner stuff a little bit, because this is the loss of soul. You know, they have concepts for this. I mean, you know, in Africa they do things differently, but the whole community participates in this liminal process by example, they'll, you know, somebody has a loss of soul. So it's not necessarily because of sexuality, but who knows what it's because of. I mean, when I was a kid, I liked to play sports and I wanted to be a boy. I wanted to play football. And my family wanted a boy and I was the oldest girl and they never had a boy. So I was kind of drawn into this kind of, you know, these weird spaces where I had to sort of perform two gender roles, I think. But anyway, that's a late discovery.
This is the ritual process, right, Victor?
It's the ritual process, yeah. And the thing is you know, they'll dig a hole or something, and the person will go into that hole, and it's kind of like a rebirth process. But the thing is there is this liminal structure to the whole thing.
Okay. I just ordered the book. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Since when do you give me homework? I'm just kidding. Bob.
Yeah, right.
I appreciated your discussion about three identities, queer, Puerto Rican, and Roman Catholic, and how they interact with each other. I live in several different identities, and I typically talk about only one of them at a time, and it gets confusing. I'm gay. I don't use the word queer. I'm cisgender as far as I'm aware. I'm a survivor of a traumatic brain injury, which has greatly impacted me. I grew up in a Christian church, but the way I'm spiritual has nothing to do with Christianity. So being an LGBT activist in the United Church of Christ, I sometimes felt that I was misrepresenting myself. I eventually retired from that work. And each of those identities, depending on the context, I will be differently open about. And so I appreciated the dynamic. There's an art show opening later in Columbus, Ohio, of high school students who are genderqueer and neurodivergent. And they're going to be having a 3-hour exhibition on Friday. And I told the woman that I'm neurodivergent, which I typically don't tell people, but I didn't say that I'm gay or that I'm a survivor of a brain injury in that conversation, because it was just too many identities to talk about all at once. But I'll tell her in the reception.
Yeah, and right. And even though I tried, like, oh yeah, I am one of these three. I am these three things together at all times. It's not that. Yeah, we certainly do that presentation. I often, you know, tell my partner like, hey, be very careful if we're in a queer circle, telling people that I'm a theologian. Okay, just be very careful. Let's like check in with me first, right? Because that might be triggering for some people. But also, or it's, I always have one of the two of other people think I'm weird and move away, or then the people start, you know, vomiting their trauma on me. and explaining to me, and I'm like, I'm here to have a drink on a Friday night, not to, but yeah, we often do that negotiation for sure. Manny, closing words since we have to wrap up.
Sorry, just thinking, thank you. I think everyone here is talking about, I'm reminded of bridge building, and the reason why I love PSR so much is because, at least for the incoming students, some of the things that came up is how does sex work, for example, become a part of that bridge building? And, Kathleen talked about grief and all these different other emotions of euphoria and these liminal spaces, and it's just like these unexplored spaces, right? So in terms of the Christian nationalist community, they too love sex, I imagine. So I imagine, for what would happen if they encounter one of their sex worker ministries? What would the conversation look like? So I just think about that. You've opened up a lot of things for all of us, and I say thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. When it comes to sex work, I think it falls in a different category as identity, but it's a great question. And I think you have questions of sexual morality here that perhaps precede, not that they don't precede the LGBTQ plus conversations either, but yeah, that's a good question. If you are making a case for a vocational identity in some way. All right, with that, I close. I thank you all for being here and for engaging in this conversation. I am very much, working on this. So it is a work in progress, this project, and the goal is to have a book contract at least by the summer. So we'll see.
Great. Nice. Thank you.
Dr. Ruiz.
Very much.
A few programs, folks, to keep on your calendars. In 2 weeks, we'll have 2 events with the first with Reverend Redeem Robinson, a call to holy troublemaking, and then Jacob Hero will be speaking on trans-religious leadership in challenging times. And it's never too early to talk about our annual Spring Boswell lecture, and this will be with Professor Brian Massingale. So this will be May 8th. The title, James Baldwin and Black Queer Prophetic Lament and Hope. This one you need to register for. So go to the CLGS website, and it'll be a Zoom webinar. So it's important that you sign up beforehand.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Schlager. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.